Yud Bet. And it's a really great story we're going to have, a lot of practical lessons you're going to see. But I think our Mishnah is really critical because the Mishnah that we're discussing is on Yud Aleph Amud Bet. And the Mishnah had a very interesting case where a person said, Hareini Nazir, I want to be a Nazir, and also I want to sponsor a Nazir, is basically what you said. So you said, Hareini Nazir, v'alai ligaleach Nazir. I'm going to, literally means I'm going to cut the hair of another Nazir, but it means I'm going to pay for all the karbanot, right? So you have a Nazir, maybe someone volunteered to be a Nazir, they can't afford, let's say it's, a couple $100 to buy all the animals, to do the whole process. So you, I guess as part of your, religious experience, say, I not only want to be a Nazir, but I want to sponsor a Nazir, right? And the next case, then the Mishnah said, I'm just repeating the Mishnah, don't worry. Then the person with you, your friend sitting next to you said, me too. I also want to be a Nazir, and I also want to sponsor another Nazir. You say both. That was yesterday's daf, what you said, me too, right? Yeah. So the Mishnah said something very clever. Well, they could each pay for the other person's Nazir now, and then they could fulfill their thing, right? Because I committed to being a Nazir. I got to do it for 30 days. When my 30 days are up, my friend, Nava here, can pay for my karbanot. And when her days are up, I can pay for her karbanot. And then, we get off on not having to pay for two. So that's what our Mishnah said. Now, the Gemara brings a case which seems a little bit unrelated, but you'll see, if you stick it out, how it gets related. The last line of Daf Yud Aleph Amud Bet, which I think is what he's up to, second to last line, Amar Reb Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Reb Yochanan. Reb Yitzchak bar Yosef said this case in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Yeah. Let's say, Ha'omer l'shlucho, person goes to their messenger, your trusted messenger, and you say, I'm ready to get married. I don't really care who I marry. Here's a ring. Go find someone and make kiddushin on my behalf. Say v'kadish li isha stam. I don't think you say isha stam. You say isha, but you don't say who, right? It could be you said isha stam. It's not important, but go and marry a woman for me. You're my messenger. You have my full authority. Go to a woman. Which you actually, Nava says you're not actually supposed to do that. We'll see why in a second. So then there's a couple words here that are missing in our Gemara, but are present in the Gemara in Gittin, which is, of course, that then you get a notification a week later that your trusted messenger has died. And now you don't know if and who that messenger set up your shidduch for. So you are presumably or maybe married to someone and you have no idea who. You're in a lot of hot water here, okay? So this is a challenge. Said Rabbi Yochanan, Asur b'kol hanashim sheba'olam. You cannot ever marry anyone in the world because chazaka, there's an assumption that shliach oseh shlichuto, that this messenger, and I don't know if you heard that part of the case, I don't know if I'm loud enough in there, but you did, okay. So the messenger died some period later, obviously not right away. They had to have a chance to marry a woman for you, but they then died. They didn't tell you who, if and who they married, and you assume that they married somebody. You gave them a job, you give someone an opportunity to do something that they could do, you assume they did it. You don't know who.
Wait a second. They're supposed to be edim at a wedding.
That's a good question. But I'm not sure they're okay. It's a good question. But we don't know who they edim are, right? You don't know. You'd have to put up a help wanted ad, kind of. Anybody know anything about this? So I'll get to that point in 1 second because Tosas raises that very important point. Anyway, says the one on the third line. Since the guy never told you because he died, you'd have no idea who he married for you. And so you're married to someone, you don't know who that person is, you can never get married because any other woman in the world might be that person's sister or mother or daughter. And you can't marry a woman and her daughter. You can't marry a woman and her sister. So you're married to one woman, you don't know who she is, but you can marry an only child. So the Gemara is going to ask a little bit whether you can marry an only child. Very good. Right? You could, we're going to say, who has no parents, right? So the parents are not alive, right? So if a person has no mother or grandmother, which are a riot, or children or grandchildren, or siblings, then you could presumably marry them.
Why?
Because then they have no relatives. So it can't be that you're married to their relative.
Because we don't know who he was married to in the first place. That's the whole
issue here. The issue is you can't marry, you're married to someone. That's the issue. You're married to a woman. You don't know who she is. So any other woman might be her mother.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Her daughter.
Not worried about plural marriage here, obviously.
No, that's not even.
I hear what you're saying. It makes sense, but I'm confused. How could you be married to somebody and be unaware of it? Didn't you have to say hooray?
Oh, yeah, but I think that they're just talking about Erusin here.
Right. So the messenger entirely replaces you. So if you say to a messenger, I want you to do this for me, they walk over to that woman and say, Harayat mikudeshet, to my person who sent me, and that's a full marriage. Then the messenger died, and you don't know who he married for you. So Tosas raises the question: what if you put out a help wanted ad and said, "I'm in real trouble. I had my messenger, Jack. I told him to marry someone. I don't know who he married. If he married you, can you please call me?" Right? Would that be good enough? Tosas doesn't use exactly that case, but meaning, what if someone came forward and said, "I was the one"? Or Tosas asked the opposite question. He says, well, why don't you say that if this happened, right? If a man says to his messenger, the shliach, marry a woman for me, okay? And then the messenger dies. Why don't you then say that every woman in the world can never get married? Because maybe she was the person, right? So one woman in the world is married and we don't know who she is. So why don't we ask that question? So Tosas says, probably, Rabbeinu Tam says, so the simple answer to the question, which Tosas doesn't quite say, is that, of course, for this man, we're assuming he's married to someone. We just don't know who that is. For a woman in the world, there's no reason to assume she's married to someone, right? Meaning the chazakah is on him because he had a messenger who you assume did the thing. Any random woman in the world doesn't have a chazakah that she's married. It means there's one woman in the world who's married, but there's no chazakah. So that's one answer, right? Is that it's the man or the woman. Tosas has a very different answer, which Tosas says, of course, if you go to marry a woman, it's reasonable to say to that person, or at least to assume, you ask them, are you married to somebody else? And if they say to you, I'm not married to somebody else, you believe them and you marry them, right? So in theory, a man can walk over to a woman and say, am I married to you? And she says no, then he can marry her mother or daughter, that kind of thing. But Tosas says that this is really all midrabanan, that we're just angry with the guy because he did something really stupid, right? You shouldn't get into a relationship that you have no parameters over. And so it's really just a takana against this person. But that's Tosas' explanation. But either way, the Gemara asked the question that here it seems, or the Gemara makes it, Rabbi Yochanan's making the assumption that if a man marries a woman, he just doesn't know who she is because the messenger died, you have to assume that any woman in the world might be married to him. And therefore he can't marry her mother or sister or daughter, okay? Rish Lakish asked the question of Yochanan from the following Mishnah in Kinim, Masechet Kinim, right? A person, let's say, has to bring a karban like a yoledet or a zav or a zava. You bring a pair of birds as your karban. Two birds, one is a chatat and one is an olah. Let's say you set aside two birds, kain stuma. You put aside two birds, but you don't decide which one is the chatat and which one is the olah. Okay, two birds. You're going to the Beit HaMikdash, and parcha gozel echad mehem la'avir ha'olam. One of the birds flew away. So you got your birds, one of them escaped. So one of your karbanot now is out there in the world. Okay. Now let's just finish the Mishnah. Or it flew against birds that are being killed, so you have to kill all of them. Or one of them dropped dead. Says the Mishnah, Yikach zug l'sheni. You just go out to the street, to the supermarket, and you buy another bird as the partner.
No, but is this
The question? One second. The question we're about to ask is: look, there's a bird in the world that was your karban, right? So if you have to assume that every bird is married to you, every woman is married to you, sorry, then you should have to assume that every bird might be your karban. How could you walk into Walmart and buy a new chick, right? Maybe it's the same one that you already had. So if this, by the same logic, if marrying one woman in the world means every woman might be that woman, having one bird in the world that is is your karban that flew away, why don't you have to worry that every bird in the world might be your karban, right? We're going to ask that question in a second. Let's just read the Gemara. Ilu, in 5 minutes, you can do it. Ilu kain mifurashat, ilo takana. Now, if you said one was a chatat and one was an olah, then it's a bigger problem because since one of them flew away, you don't know which one it was. I mean, you don't know if it was the chatat or the olah. So you couldn't just go buy a second bird and say this will fill in, because you don't know if you're buying a chatat or an olah, and you don't know if the one you should bring on the mizbeach is the chatat or the olah. So you got to start over, right? You need two new ones. But ilu shar kinin ba'alma mitaknan. You can go out and buy other birds. Va'amai. How could you go to Walmart and buy a bird? Lema kol chada v'chada dilma hainihu. Maybe any bird that you pick up in the store is this bird, right? Now, of course, in my example, it's not as big a problem because if you can prove that the birds were in Walmart since they were born, right, you can prove that it's not your bird, let's say. But assuming that wasn't the case, right? They had wild birds then. They didn't have Walmart. So any bird that you go and pick up in the shuk that someone trapped might be your bird that flew away. So why don't you ask, how can you make that assumption that it's not? Says the Gemara, Amrle, so they responded, Yochanan said back to Reish Lakish, 1 second. Kamina ana isha de lo naida. I'm talking about marrying a woman who doesn't fly away, right? Remember that when we talk about chazakah, there's a principle that the words are kol kavua kimechza mechzadami. Anything that's kavua, meaning it's sort of fixed in place, it's like it's a 50-50 situation. So it's not, and the opposite is that kol de parish, anything that goes away from a group is meruba parish, is considered to be from the majority. So birds, the majority of birds in the world are not your bird, right? Only one bird out of the billions in the world are your bird. So if a bird flies away from that majority, you assume it came from the majority that are not your bird. But since people, or women in this case, are static, they are kavua, then you have to assume that this might be the person, and the chazakah would stand that it might be her, and therefore you can't marry anyone in the family. So where am I? I'm talking about a woman, the lonaida. She's not mobile, right? I'm really at isura. You're telling me about isra of a bird, denayid, which moves around. What do you mean? How do you know that a woman's not mobile? Maybe you didn't find her at home. Right? Maybe you married her and when she was out and about. But she goes back home. Gabi Kane, Mihadra, bird doesn't go back to one specific spot. It lives anywhere, a wild bird. And so therefore there's no comparison. A bird is not a fixed thing. And therefore any bird that's an individual bird must be from the majority of birds, which are not your karban. But you have to assume, says Rabbi Yochanan, that any woman in the world might be the woman that your shliach married for you and might be married to you. So now you could probably marry that woman, of course. But the problem is that if she has a mother, maybe the shliach married her mother. And then you can't marry that woman because you're married to her mother already, right? So any person would be a problem if they had a relative who would be prohibited to you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could get around this by telling the shaliach, you can only marry somebody from ages, whatever.
Well, so that's another, right. So Tosas, I didn't mention this before. Tosas, when I talked about this question, but just asking the woman, Tosas points out that remember, a shliach can marry a woman who's 6 or 7 years old if her father gives permission, right? So that's the other issue is that what about just asking the woman, but you can't ask minors, you can't trust them. Were you married, right? They wouldn't necessarily even know, to be honest, or they wouldn't be reliable. So that's the other issue is that because in theory, this can involve all women, even very young women, you really aren't stuck. You don't know who your shliach married.
Right, unless you specify to the shaliach what the parameters are.
Correct, which is Tosas says what you should do. Any normal person would say.
Right.
Right. So that's the first question. Nava's got to run. Amar Rava, says Rava, Moda Rabbi Yochanan, Be'isha, Rabbi Yochanan would admit that you can marry a woman, she'ein la lobat, v'lo bat bat, v'lo bat ben, a woman who doesn't have a daughter, so there's no chance you're married to her daughter. She doesn't have a granddaughter, either from her son or her daughter, right? So she could have a son, but her son doesn't have a daughter. V'lo aim, she doesn't have a mother. V'lo aim, she doesn't have a grandmother. V'lo achot, and she doesn't have a sister, right? Because then you can go marry her, because you might already be married to her. So you're marrying her a second time. That's fine, right? But you're not married to any of her relatives. Now we get to our Gemara. Well, your question is probably why we mentioned this at all. Continues the Gemara.
In a situation, couldn't you, let's say you wanted to marry somebody, couldn't you give them a get just on the case that you actually...
Well, you'd have to kill them, right? So, you can't marry. Right? You could wipe out her whole family, but I don't think she's going to want to marry you anymore. The exception is her sister, right? The only one you could.
Oh, you'd have to kill the sister.
No, the mother, the daughter.
Right.
If you're married to a mother and divorce her, you can't then marry her daughter.
Right, that's true.
That's
Okay.
the sister in theory. Anyway, so let's keep going. The sister also, yeah, if not if she's alive. So now adds Rava. This is why we're bringing this Gemara now, even though both because it's interesting, but because of this next line. Now, when I say that you could marry a woman who doesn't have a sister, in fact, you can marry a woman even if she has a sister, as long as her sister was married at the time that you said to your shliach, go marry a woman for me, right? Let's say on Monday, you go to the shliach and you say, I want you to marry a woman for me. And this woman, Rachel we'll call her, has no mother, no children. So it can't be that the shliach married her mother for you or her children. But she does have a sister who we'll call Leah, right? So then in theory, you can't ever marry Rachel because maybe your shliach married Leah and maybe your shliach married Rachel, so you can't marry her. But if, let's say, Leah was married on Monday when you went to your shliach, but, says Rava, Leah then got divorced on Tuesday, and your shliach died 2 weeks later. So it's conceivable that your shliach waited 2 days, Leah got divorced, he married Leah, and now you can't marry Rachel because you might have been married to her sister. Says Rava, you don't have to worry about that. Since Leah was married at the time you made the shliach, Leah is considered to be off balance. She's not in the picture. And so you can assume that she wasn't the person your shliach married for you because he couldn't do it at the time you made him the shliach. Okay, that's what Rava says. So let's read that inside. That woman would be mutter. Rachel would be mutter even if she had a sister who was married and then was divorced before the shliach died. My taima, why would that be permitted? That at the time that you spoke to your shliach and said, go marry a woman for me, having nesivin legavri. She was already married to a man, so you can't marry two people, right? So even if he gave her kedushin, nothing would happen. And kimashia shliach b'milta dekaima kamei, when you appoint a person to be your shliach, it's only what's possible at that moment. And at that moment, he can't marry Leah because she's already married, right? B'milta delokaima kamei lo mashvi shliach. You don't appoint a shliach for something that's not possible in front of you. When people say to someone else, I want you to marry a woman for me, he means someone's available right now. And that's what that's all a shliach is allowed to assume. Because you have to assume that he didn't know that this woman was on the market, right? Because she was married. If something changes, you can't say that the shliach has a right to marry any woman who's possible at that time.
Makes no sense.
Sorry?
Makes no sense.
Why not?
Well, let's say you go to the shliach, buy me some meat at the supermarket. And at the time, there was no meat in the supermarket. But when the time the shliach showed up, the meat was in the supermarket.
Okay.
He
So
can't find that meat?
That's a very good question. We're gonna discuss this, so don't go home yet. But what the Gemara is saying right now is what Rava is saying is that when I appointed a shliach, my imagination was only to allow that shliach to do what is available right now. And so exactly what you said would be the case. So I said to the shliach, I want you to go to the supermarket and buy me meat. And they went to the supermarket and there was no meat, but the next day there was, and they bought me meat. Then the meat that was there they wouldn't be doing their shlichut. Even though I didn't set a parameter, I didn't set a time parameter. Now, of course, it might be different if you're marrying someone or you're buying meat. It's what's the assumption in the mind of a person. Well, ask the Gemara then from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah seemed to imply that's not the case. Because what did you say in our Mishnah? Now we quote our Mishnah, right? It's not 5 lines from the bottom, which remember was not a shliach. A person says, and we're quoting our Mishnah from yesterday, 5 lines from the bottom, Hareini Nazir, I want to be a Nazir and Alay Legalech Nazir, and I'm going to sponsor another Nazir. And then Shama Chavero, your friend heard sitting next to you, and he said, Amar, Ava'ani, me too, V'alay Legalech Nazir. And I also will sponsor another Nazir. Said the Mishnah, we're still quoting, Imhaya Pikhin, if they're smart, Migalchin Zed Zed. Each one will pay for the other Nazir, their friend, right? Because you have to be a Nazir, but you also only have to sponsor one. So you can get away with only paying for one set of karbanot by paying for your friend. Imlav, if you're not so smart, Migalchin Nizirin Achirim, you got to pay for somebody else. So now ask the Gemara, what about, you just told me that when a person says something, they only have in mind what's available right then. If the first person said, I want to be a Nazir and I want to sponsor another Nazir, their friend wasn't a Nazir yet. So you couldn't have meant that you were going to sponsor their Nazirut. They didn't say yet. They didn't say they want to do it yet. So Bishlama Batra'a, I understand the second one, obviously, Ika Kadma'a Kameh. The first one said, I want to be a Nazir. So when he said, the second one said, me too, and I'll sponsor a Nazir, he could have in mind the first Nazir. Ela Kadma'a, but the first one, when he said, I want to be a Nazir and I want to sponsor a Nazir, his friend Shimon hadn't become a Nazir yet. Mika Batra'a Kameh, it's not in front of him. Says the Gemara, Ella must be the Hachikamer. When a person says, I'm going to pay for a Nazir, he doesn't say, I'm going to pay for a current Nazir. He's saying, Imishkachna dahavi Nazir, agachay. I'll find a Nazir. I don't mean that it's necessarily what's happening right now. I mean, at some point in the future, I will pay for a Nazir. It doesn't have to be someone who's active now. It could be someone even in the future. So if that's what people mean when they speak, Hachanami, Hachikamerle. Why can't that be what you say to your messenger? I tell my messenger, can you go out and marry a woman for me? I don't mean just anyone who's available right now. I mean anyone who's available at the time that you go ahead and do it. So I must mean, if you find a woman who is now married but then becomes divorced, Kaddish leave. She's a good match. You can marry her for me, right? So I don't get why, if our Mishnah very clearly shows you that when a person says, I want to sponsor a Nazir, there's no reason to think they mean a Nazir from the past. They can mean a Nazir even in the future. So when a person says to their messenger, go marry a woman for me, why does that have to be a woman you can marry today? I didn't say marry today, right? I said come back in a month with a wife. So maybe a woman who gets divorced in 2 weeks should be included. Ella, says the Gemara, you know what? The reality is, Amri, sorry, they said back to him, that it's a big difference between your own commitment and when you appoint a messenger, right? Because you appoint a messenger, and essentially, this is how I would understand it, is that, the parameters are what's capable, what you can do today. I trust you among all the women who are available in this town, let's say, which is, of course, what you assumed, right? That you could pick one out for me. I know what the options are, but I don't know what's going to be an option in 2 weeks, and I'm not appointing you to use your own judgment. I am, but a judgment based on right now. So Amri, they said, right? Sorry. Lo mashvi in a shliach ella b'milta dematzi avid hashta. A person only appoints a shliach in general. Again, you can explicitly say anything you want, but if you don't explicitly say it, a person's intention is only to appoint a shliach in something that you can do right now. The milta de lo matzi avid le hashta lo mashvi shliach. You don't appoint a messenger for something that you cannot do right now. So although when you personally speak and say, I want to sponsor a Nazir, there's no reason to think it means only an active Nazir, right? Or only a previously committed Nazir. But when you appoint a Shliach, we make the assumption that you're only giving them agency over what you can do right at this moment, not what becomes possible in the future.
But
That's
that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, how is that? It should be what is possible at the time the Shaliach is fulfilling his shlichut.
So what we're saying now, I don't know what should be. I mean, obviously you could say if you want to do that, but we're asking what is a person's, assumption? And what we're saying is that when you put your trust in someone else,
that's his assumption.
Okay, well, we're going to keep going because the Gemara is going to question it. Don't worry, but you can see why it's possible. You may not like it.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, let's keep going. Tashma. Now we try to bring a proof for 6 lines from the top from a Gemara that we had recently, a couple months ago, actually a month ago in Nidarim. And the case in Nidarim was, Omer la apotropos. A person says to their, I forget how we translate apotropos, like a agent, I guess, right? So
guardian or
guardian. Okay, guardian's a good word, right? Right. So basically, you ask someone to take over your estate, right? You're going away on a trip.
trustee.
You ask someone to step in for you, a power of attorney, and they, take care of your affairs and all your stuff until you get back. So obviously you say, take care of my family and the bills and the this, etc. So a person says to the apotropos, Shelo, Kol nidarim shetadur ishti mikan ad shavo mimakom ploni. Any netter that my wife, right, a husband has an ability to be mayfair the nidarim of his wife, right? We discussed that in the last Masechet. So he's going away, so he's not going to hear about them. There was no phones back then, right? So he says to his apotropos, any nidarim that my wife makes until I get back in 2 months from my trip to Alaska, right? Kol nidarim shetidur ishti mikan ad shavo mimakom ploni haferla. I want you to be made for those nidarim. Okay, so the guy goes on his trip. His wife makes a netter that she wants to be, let's say, a Nazir. The apotropos hears about it and says, no, I want to cancel that netter, right? Says the Valferla, and the apotropos is made for it. You might think that he can do it. Yachol yehenu farim. You might think that, okay, he has the power, he's the shliach, he's allowed to do it. Talmud Lomar, therefore, the pasuk specifically adds an extra pasuk of isha yikimeno v'isha yiferenu. The husband can hold it up, and the husband can cancel it, but not a messenger. Divrei Rabbi Yoshaya, right? That's Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonatan says, no, that doesn't make any sense. We find everywhere in the Torah that a person's messenger is like him. Now, even according to the Tanakama, the only reason that it doesn't work if the messenger does it is the Amar Rachmana, because the Torah says, Isha yikimenu v'isha yifirenu, right? But halavachi, if that wasn't the case, apotropos mefer, right? It seems like the apotropos can get rid of her neder. Even though, let's be very clear, this is a netter that she made after the husband went away. So he doesn't know about it. At the time that he made the messenger, there was no netter, right? 2 weeks later, the wife said, I want to be a Nazir. The apotropos said, I want to get rid of that. The husband didn't exist when he went on his trip. Now, could a husband be made for a netter for the future? Could he? Ask the Gemara. But remember, Ilugabi Didei, Tanya, remember we had a discussion about the husband himself. And the Braita said, "Ha'omer le'ishto." Let's say a man says to his wife, "Kol nidarim shetaduri mikan ad shavo mimakom ploni." Right? I am going away for 2 months. I want you to know, don't make any nidarim because and you can't get out of it. Any netter you make until I get home, you kayamim. It will be finalized, right? You can't get out of it, so you better be very careful. Says the Braita, lo amar klum. It doesn't mean anything. You can't be makayim something that doesn't exist. But what if he says harehin mufarim? What if he says, look, I'm telling you ahead of time, any netter you make in the next 2 months, I'm canceling it, right? Which is what the shliach was able to do. So then says the Braita, Rebbe Eliezer omer mufar. Rebbe Eliezer says, you can do it. You can cancel a netter before it happened. But the chachamim omrim eino mufar. Right? The Chachamim said you can't be mefer. So it seems, and we discussed this a lot in Nidarim, right? A machloket about whether you can mefer Nidarim that have not happened yet. And it's a machloket. Rabbi Meir says you can, Rabbi Eliezer says you can, and the Chachamim say you cannot. Now the question is that these are the Tanaim, the Amoraim, Rabbi Yoshia, and Rabbi Yonatan, who are they arguing according to? So we thought, Kasal Kedaita, we think that Ki Amar Rabbi Yoshaya aliba de Rabbanan, he's going according to Rabbanan, which would be the majority, to Amri lo matzi mefir, right? That the husband could not do that. The husband cannot get up and say to his wife, I'm going away for 2 months. Any netter you make in the future 2 months will be mefer, right? However, you can't do that. Can a shliach do that? No, he can't, because the pasuk says Isha yikimenu, right? But if it hadn't been the case that there's an extra verse that says don't do that, I would have thought that apotropos havi mefer, that the messenger could do it. Now, how could the messenger do it if the husband can't do it? Right? The principle you just gave was that at the time that you made the messenger, which was before you went away, if it didn't exist then, if you couldn't do it, you can't give over agency to your messenger. So according to all of these, according to the Chachamim, you can't be made for a netter for the future. And according to the literal meaning, except for the pasuk, the agent could. How's that possible? Says, well, okay, maybe you're right. It does seem to argue against me, which Hanan's happy about. But maybe Dilma aliba Rebbe Eliezer kam the Amar Matzi Mefer. Maybe it's because it's going according to Rebbe Eliezer, who said no. In fact, the husband could be mefer for the future. Right, and so you have this future power to be mefer, and you say to your messenger, "I want to give that power over to you." Right, so maybe it's according to Rabbi Eliezer, Damar Matzi Mefer. Says, well, if that's the case, in Cain, why do you have to take a messenger and say, if my wife makes a netter, I want you to get rid of it? Why don't you just make an announcement? Any netter that my wife makes, I want to get rid of. If you have that ability, what's the messenger adding? Right, lay for law, EU. Why don't you get rid of it on your own? Says the Gemara, well, I'll tell you why. Because Dilma, where am I? Dilma Mishtalina, Kasabar, he thinks, Dilma Mishtalina, I maybe will get sort of distracted, or ritachna, or I'll get angry, or mitrad dina, or I'll get very busy with my trip. I'm worried that I'm going to wait till the last minute, till right before my trip. Is how Rashi understands, the Mefarish understands it. I am worried that I don't wait. Let's say it's a week before the trip, right? You go to this messenger and say, I'm going to be away from January 8th, whatever, till then. I could, right before I go away, right? I don't want to cancel all my wives in Durham now because I don't know what she's going to say in the next week. But I could, and I can't say I want to be made for, you can't do like scheduled time out, right? I want to be made for all in Durham between March 1st and March 15th. So I could say from now until I get back, but I don't want to cancel all in Durham now. And I'm afraid that, the day comes, as everybody who's traveled, especially then when it was probably much more complicated, that on the day that I'm leaving, I'm not going to have a moment or time to sit down and announce that I'm canceling all her Nedarim. I'll get distracted. I'll be angry because we're late, we're this and that. And therefore, as part of my plan for my trip, it's like buying trip insurance, right? I want to schedule that I have this apotropos who will take care of these responsibilities. But in reality, the only reason I could appoint the messenger to do it is because I could have done it at that time, right before I left my trip, or even right now. And so that's, and where it concludes, as Hanan would point out, it's not the strongest conclusion, and it's not so clear at the end whether, in fact, we go with this opinion and what you can appoint a messenger to do.
Right. So, in I forgot what we said in Nadarim. Could a husband just say, like at the beginning of the marriage, anything that you make, any neder, mayfair, it's mayfair.
So it's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim.
That's what this machloket is.
Yeah, it's this machloket. And the Chachamim say you can, which is presumably how we pass. I mean, is how we pass.
Right, because doesn't he have to hear about it?
Well, that's so that's what the pasuk said. That was the argument there, right? The pasuk says Shama Isha. Remember, he hears about it. Yeah, but Rabbi Eliezer said he can say in the future. That was that. Okay, let's continue with the Mishnah. We'll do this Mishnah. We've got some time. Yeah. Harei alai legaleh chatzi nazir. Let's say a person says, I want to donate. Now, we're not clear what he means here, but the Mishnah says, I want to pay for half of a nazir. You can afford the whole thing, right? It costs maybe $1,000 for a whole, maybe $500 for a whole nazir. I schedule half. People do it all the time. But you pay for half of whatever, half of the kiddush. Okay, so I'm going to pay for half of a nazir. And then his friend Shamach Haverov Amar Va'ani, right? Alai legaleh chatzi nazir. I also, yesterday we discussed why you have to say me too, right? Remember we had a whole discussion that mainly this was just done because the Reisha, the first Mishnah, also said the language of Va'ani, right? Here it's much less important.
It's like a Nazir GoFundMe page or something.
Yeah, exactly. But we say it that way, but obviously the spiritual power of a Nazir was very strong, right? People felt very connected. There are plenty of people today, you give $18 to this, you give to that. So people felt very connected, obviously throughout Tanakh, so its concept, to sponsoring a Nazir, to supporting a Nazir, to being a Nazir. So that's your commitment.
This idea is that he made himself a Nazir, but he can't really afford to bring.
No, he didn't make himself a Nazir in this case. He just said, I'm going to pay for another Nazir. So this is like, you go to the Beit HaMikdash and there's people who are Nazirim, and they can't afford their korbanot necessarily. So they did the work, right? You pay the bills. This happens all the time.
Like this gets me angry. I mean, don't become a Nazir if you can't afford the, okay. It's like schnorring,
No, but you do the work. That's the harder part. Someone else pays the bills. Either way, maybe if it's an arranged thing, I think it makes more sense. But that was your commitment. I'm going to go to the Beit HaMikdash and I'm going to send my check for half of a Nazir. And your friend says, me too, I'll do half a Nazir too. So this is perfect, right? Because together you can pay for one Nazir, right? We love it. So says the Mishnah, Harei alai legaleh chatzi nazir, v'shamach haverov amar va'ani alai legaleh chatzi nazir. Says the Mishnah, you can't do half a Nazir. Zem megalech Nazir shalem, you got to pay for a full one. V'zem megalech Nazir shalem, divrei Rabbi Meir, there's no halves. Once you commit, you're committed. And Chachamim say, no, there is a half. Zem megalech chatzi nazir, this one pays to bring the korbanot and the end procedure for half a Nazir, v'zem megalech for half of a Nazir. Now it says Rava, Amar Rava, Rashi, or the Mefarish here has a whole bunch of different pshatim in the Girsa here, but I'm going to read what we have in our Gemara. Amar Rava, Hakol Motim. Look, everybody agrees, that meaning everybody in our Mishnah, Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, Kohecha da Amar Chatzi Karbanot Nazir Alai. If you say, I want to pay for half of the karban of a Nazir, right? Then chatzi carbon mighty, right? You bring half the carbon. You said it very clearly. You pay 50% of the cost of the animals. If you said karbanot chatzi nazir alai, I want to bring the carbon of half of a nazir. There's no such thing as half a nazir, right? You can't be half a nazir. So then kule carbon ba'yetuye, right? There's no such thing as a carbon for half a nazir. The nazir, half a nazir is a nazir. You got to bring the full thing. My time, the paga. You don't find such a thing as saying I commit to half a nazirut. Ki pligi belishna de matnitim pligi. They argue specifically where you said the language of our Mishnah, which was Hare alai legaleh chatzi nazir. I will finish the procedure for half of a nazir. Why? Rabbi Meir Savar, look, what you said, Kivan de Amar, Hare alai. You said you accepted on yourself the responsibility. The second you did that, chayav akule karban, nazirut. You were chayav for an entire nazir. Then you sort of got cold feet and you said, wait a second, that's a lot of money. And so you qualified it, right? Everyone does that. I'll pay half, right? That's the way. So once you said, I will pay, you got to pay the whole thing. The half, you can't just reduce your commitment. And Rabbi Meir often does this. He goes with the first language, right? Remember we go tfos lashon rishon. When you said hare alai, the language of I accept on myself, that requires you the whole deal. Rabbanan Savri, no, Rabbanan say, look, you got to listen to the whole sentence. It's neder upedachimohu. You made a commitment, hare alai, but you got to let the guy finish his sentence. And he finished his sentence, he clearly just committed to half a nazirut. And so that is a question just of semantics. How do you view the first language or the entire sentence? According to Rabbi Meir, you said you made a commitment. You can't then qualify your commitment. And so you got to bring the whole nazirut. And according to the Chachamim, you can look at the whole sentence as a qualification, and therefore you only have to bring half of a nazirut. But it's not a bigger question. You certainly can't be half of a nazir. And I think we should stop there because the next Mishnah goes on for quite a bit. And it's not such a long daf. So we'll stop there. Shavua Tov, what time are we going to learn tomorrow?
I think.
So Miriam voting for 7:30, right?
Yes.
Hanan, are you okay with that?
7:30 p.m. Oh, I can't do it in the evening, but that's okay. I'll make it up. No, I'm just going out tomorrow evening.
So let me do this. I'm okay. What about, we have a machriya. You're muted. You're muted, Robert.
I'm sorry. I was talking to myself then.
Yeah.
Okay. I should be able to make it, but if I can't, then I'll watch the recording. My children might be making a Tu B'Shvat Seder tomorrow night.
Okay, that's tomorrow night.
I might be busy with the.
How about the morning? What if we did it at 7:45 in the morning?
7:45 should be good. Here in Lakewood, I daven at 7 a.m. So 7:45 is just about when I get out.
Okay, Hanan, do you have a 7:45?
I can try. Yeah, I should be.
So Miriam, I'm going to put it on the WhatsApp. We'll have to take a vote.
Okay.
I know.
I mean, if you do it in the morning, I'll catch up. It's fine.
I know, but let me just put it out there. I'm available either time, but let me put it out and see what.
Okay.
I mean, if I miss it, I'll just watch the recording. So
No, I appreciate that. We'll record it regardless. So let's see what we can do. Okay, everyone. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Eli.
Tomorrow.
Shavua Tov.
Okay, bye.